Michael, it's great to see you again. How are things as we look at Q3 in the rear view, begin to look at Q4 and talk about all things payments, fraud, and specifically real-time account-to-accounts payments fraud?
Things are very well, and there's a lot of exciting stuff happening in Form 3. And we just came back from one of the most important conferences that we attend every year, the Swift Payment Conference, Sibos, in Toronto. And I think the team and I are still buzzing from the excitement and the all the good feedback that we got there. So yeah, things are good.
Before we dive into some of the news of the day, which includes your partnership with Visa, what was some of the buzz around Sibos, particularly as it relates to real-time payments and the fraud associated with it?
Well, I think in general, payments are still a hot topic. I think we've seen statistics recently with the current, past, and future volume growth that we're seeing across the board, and also the associated revenue growth that we're seeing there. So I think payments are still a very exciting growth business, despite the fact that they've been around for so long. So what's driving that growth? And I think in many ways, at the moment, real-time payments are pretty much on top of that list. And there's a lot of talk about CBDC and blockchain and other things, but the real growth that we're seeing in many of the markets is related to the fact that you can now transfer money in real time. The other side of that, as you mentioned quite rightly, is obviously fraud. Real-time money movements make it a lot easier for fraudsters to operate and effectively, move money on quickly to conceal the origin of the payment. So I think you have to see the two things together. And we've had a lot of interesting conversations about both the rise of real-time payments and the technology demands in that area, and the rise of payment fraud, in particular authorized push payment fraud, on the back of it.
You have a unique perspective, given where you sit in the UK with respect to account-to-account faster payments. In the UK, you process about 10% of the volume, which is significant. How big is the fraud problem, and how complicated is it for banks to address it, given the tools they currently use?
Well, I think the important thing to notice is, and I think banks are making that point, I think more actively these days, that a lot of the fraud actually doesn't happen in the banking infrastructure, not even in the banking or payment ecosystem. A lot of the fraud happens on platforms. It happens in the real world. All this fraud is typically based on the fact that somebody's tricked into making a payment that they actually don't want to make, or that they make a payment to an account that is simply incorrect. Of course, this is affected in the banking system in a way that there is a fraudulent account somewhere. So someone has opened an account with a specific purpose to receive money from someone who didn't want to pay to that account. And that means it puts a lot of pressure and burden on KYC processes, and know your customer processes, the account opening process as such. Now, there's a lot of things that the banks can do to prevent payment fraud by using the data that they have, and by using smart analytics that they deploy to make use of that data, preferably whilst the payment is still in flow. And I think that's really the area that we're focusing on. Overall, you mentioned the UK, and the good news is for us, we will actually process a lot more than 10% of the UK payments. The market in the UK is quite mature when it comes to the rollout of real-time payments, more mature than the US, for instance, or Europe. And that means the fraud situation is probably also more advanced than what we find in the other two geographies. And that means that we strongly believe there's a lot of lessons to be learned from what we're seeing in the UK for the other markets where real-time payment systems are starting to grow. And as they ramp up, I'm 100% convinced that we will also see more fraud in these markets. The flip side of that is obviously that we're putting a lot of money and effort and investment into building fraud prevention technology, and we can actually hone our skills in the UK, where that problem is much bigger than it is in the other geographies. But we're looking to obviously expand that proposition then to other markets.
What are some of the lessons that can be exported into the US market? I mean, specifically, I think about financial scams, which is, a growing incidence of fraud. A report that we just issued last week shows that it's more than doubled for some of the largest banks in the US. And it is, as you point out, consumers being tricked into sending money. These, bank impersonator schemes or IRS impersonator schemes, consumers feel as though they're being asked to do something by an authority. They move the money. So it's social engineering. How does all of this relate to what banks need to do in order to use AI and other tools to stop that fraud from actually happening?
I think one of the key lessons that we've learned in the UK market is that there is not a single solution to this problem. So there's no magic wand. There's nothing you can do other than basically shutting down real-time payments that will eliminate push payment fraud. So we believe that the solution is actually a combination of many different measures that the banks need to adopt. And a lot of that is related to technology, but some of it isn't. So I think, again, solid account opening procedures with, know your customer and other checks that banks would typically do are a big part of it. You do need to have an account to make this happen. On the bank side, beyond that, I think there are a few measures that have been implemented in the UK. Confirmation of payee is I think, one of those tools, and an effective one, most certainly. For those who are not familiar with that, that's basically a account number and name check that happens when the payment is initiated. So as soon as you capture the account details and the account name of the beneficiary of a payment, you get a response from the beneficiary bank, whether there's a match. That eliminates one particular type of fraud where the account number and the account name don't match, and you pretend to be someone, the account name belongs to someone else. That is effective. But the harsh reality is it hasn't eliminated push payment fraud. It may have brought it down. We wouldn't know what it would be otherwise. But the hard numbers are that push payment fraud has not come down massively, despite the widespread rollout of this particular tool. So, but it's only one of those instruments that banks can use to manage the situation.
It isn't the assumption, though, that fraudsters are going to continue to trick consumers into giving their account credentials because they're going to pose as, bank technical support or a bank officer or the IRS or a bill collector. So the assumption is that the consumer, a population of consumers will do that. So the pressure is on the financial institution to stop it. I mean, it almost seems as though that needs to be the sort of the working assumption for how fraud systems and tools need to be engineered.
Yes, and as I said, I think there's a multitude of different things you can do, and my expectation is that every one of these initiatives or tools will chip away and reduce push payment fraud, make it harder for the fraudsters to get hold of your money. Again, experience shows, however, there's no single tool that will eliminate it completely. So the support that we can provide to our customers beyond the confirmation of payee product that I just mentioned is that we have the payment data of a number of different institutions on our platform. because we're processing payments for them. So it gives us a very rich data set that we have in real-time payments. And we're working very hard to basically mine that data with the help of artificial intelligence to basically identify patterns in those data sets that would reveal the likelihood of a fraudulent payment. And then the second piece of that is that we're doing this in real time whilst the payment has not been sent to the central infrastructure yet, so the clearing and settlement. And that means with that technology, we can effectively stop payment fraud in its tracks before it actually happens, because we can make sure that the money never leaves the customer's account. And I think that should be and will be a very effective way of managing this. And this is currently in proof of concept with a number of banks. The initial results are very encouraging. And again, this is only possible because we have the data sets of a number of different banks, and we have the real-time payment processing on our platform, which basically allows us to do this not after the event, but whilst the payment is still in flow. And mind you, these payments are only in flow for a few hundred milliseconds. So it's a very fast process.
I was going to ask you, do you think that real-time will need to be redefined? So milliseconds comes 30 minutes or an hour, so that there's more time to stop a bad payment from being pushed to the wrong account?
I don't think so, to be honest, Karen. So I think the technology today is good enough to basically perform these fraud checks, not in real time. In real time is a big word, right? So I think it would be probably better to say near real time, because it still takes some time for the money to arrive on the other side.
Right.
But again, the scheme rules typically say you have a few seconds to make sure the money arrives on the other side. The agreements with our customers allow us to have the payment on our platform for a few hundred milliseconds of that. And that is typically enough time for us to perform these fraud checks. And therefore, I don't think that you necessarily need to change the processing times or insert friction into the process. Of course, once a payment has exceeded a certain threshold in terms of the likelihood of fraud, then we're playing that back to our customers, and they play it back to their customers, and they can either then decide to investigate the payment, and that will introduce friction, of course, or they can decide to just stop the payment and tell the payer that they shouldn't really make this payment. In the first case, yes, there will be more friction, but this is for a very, very small subset of payments that would fall into that category.
You think regulation is a headwind or a tailwind when it comes to real-time account-to-account fraud?
It's a very good question. So when we've been discussing that with the banks, and I think the different pieces of regulation coming in, and this is also very market specific, I suppose. So I think in this case, banks would first and foremost look at their data and data protection legislation, and potential or perceived issues around data sharing, which facilitates all this. Now, again, for us, it's slightly easier because, we're processing for the banks on the same platform. So it's a platform-based approach to payment processing, which basically means we can use the data without sharing the data. And we obviously never share data with banks. We only play back to them whether we think this payment is fraudulent. So this is a fairly a straightforward process from that perspective. I think some other industry initiatives rely on data sharing, which is slightly harder to achieve under GDPR and similar rules that have been implemented here in the UK and in Europe. And I'm sure there's similar legislation in the US. Now, there's other legislation as well. And I would point to the one that is coming in or will be coming in Europe, where the access to real-time payment systems will become more mandatory, where there will be price regulation and basically making sure that a real-time payment is not more expensive than a non-real-time payment. But the third element is that banks will be mandated to implement fraud protection technology. And I think that's a bit of a tailwind for the industry, because it's no longer acceptable to not invest in this area. So in general, I would not see regulation as a major hurdle, at least not in the sort of in the space that we're operating in. And I don't think it should be an excuse for any bank not to implement this vital piece of consumer protection.
How are banks thinking about investing in this technology for this particular use case? I mean, obviously, this is a high priority because it is the direction that the payments are trending, of course, in so many different use cases. But is it a top priority? Is it the top 5 priority? One of the top 5 priorities? The banks that you've talked to, where does this sit, and how are they approaching it?
Well, again, it depends a little bit on the geography and the prevalence of real-time payments, really. But if you take the UK as an example, it's a key priority for them. There is a shift in the liability rules for these payments. So banks in general have more liability, but also banks will have to share the liability differently, which basically puts it further up the agenda of many of these banks. So there is also, I think, that provides a very clear business case and commercial incentive to reduce push payment fraud, because otherwise the banks will be liable for it, and the cost of push payment fraud is going up. More importantly, however, and I've made that point before, we should not forget the role of the end customer in this, and the consumer. And this is a piece of consumer protection. And beyond the commercial aspects, I think it's an important piece of consumer protection because nobody likes to be the victim of a fraud attack, and there's a lot of I think pain that goes with it. Even if you get the actual money back from the bank, it's a process, it's uncertainty, and so I think banks have good financial incentives, but I think also a moral obligation to do everything that they can do to keep their customers safe.
It's interesting because I'm so in tune to these schemes and these scams that even when you get a legitimate call from an investment advisor or the bank, you hesitate. Is this really Charles Schwab, or is this someone impersonating Charles Schwab? I mean, it becomes complicated because you don't really know what channels to trust other than your app, of course. When you get phone calls or emails from people who are in fact legitimately asking for information about an account or transaction.
And these fraud attempts or fraud cases become more and more sophisticated. And this is also where technology comes in on the other side. So it's a bit of an arms race, really. So with artificial intelligence, it is now possible to get around voice recognition technology, face recognition technology. And I think moving forward, it will be even harder to distinguish for the end customer whether your counterparty is who he says or she says she is, whether that counterparty is actually even real. And you take this interview, for instance, and somebody is certainly in a position to use your voice, my voice, anyone's voice that is out there on the web to basically trick people into situations that they don't want to be in. And we need to tackle this in the real world, but we also need to make sure that the banking system does what it can to prevent the money movement. At the end of the day, this is where it all comes together, regardless what sort of fraud It is invoice fraud, Roman scams, all of this. At the end of the day, there will have to be transfer of value. And I think that's where the bank's role comes in. And I think this is where we as a technology provider to those banks can play an important role.
So Michael, talk to me a little bit about the Visa partnership, which includes an investment and access to Visa's partner and their vast ecosystem, significance to Form 3, and significance to solving the big problem we spent the last 20 minutes talking about.
Yes, so we're very excited about the Visa partnership, and we have published the fact that Visa have become an investor in Form 3, which is great. But more importantly, we have completed an agreement or a commercial partnership, and that really has two parts to it. One is the distribution of our technology to Visa customers, where Visa, same as MasterCard, have recognized that the real-time payments will play a greater role in the payments ecosystem. The other side of it is probably more interesting for the topic we just discussed, and that is a collaboration on fraud prevention. And this is us tapping into what Visa call the RTP Prevent product. And that means we interface with Visa to get another score for that payment. So we have our own fraud detection technology, which is largely based on, as I said, the data sets and some artificial intelligence that we use to mine that. But this gives us access to a whole different data set. And a lot of that is card-based. So for the first time, we're actually able to use card-based fraud prevention technology in the real-time payments world. And I think for decades, the card schemes, and same applies to MasterCard, the card schemes have have been best practice when it comes to real-time fraud prevention, because they operate in the e-commerce and the point of sale space. And that is a real-time payment, and there is a lot of fraud in that space. And I think they've been honing their skills in that area for many years and decades. So for us to bring together the real-time payment processing, so the rails that we have for the banks, the scores that we can generate ourselves with the data sets that we have and the artificial intelligence that we use, and additional scores that we can generate from third parties and other sources. I think that all together will provide the highest level of fraud protection in real-time payments. And it will, I think, be a massive step towards bringing those percentages of fraudulent payments and the associated costs down.
So how does the card best practices complement what you know about the account-to-account real-time payments behaviors? Are they different? Are they similar? Is looking at the consumer behavior? Are you looking at the receiver behavior? What is it that's particularly relevant?
Well, we're basically scanning the beneficiary account of the payment. So, these things all work in a way that, you need to know something about an account that you don't really or necessarily have on your platform. And the interesting thing here is that there's typically a debit card issued for each of those accounts. And Visa do have a lot of information, either from the account-to-account space or from the card space, to basically bring this together and provide fraud prevention intelligence that we otherwise wouldn't have. So this goes well beyond in terms of the methodology, the scoring, the intelligence, the algorithms that they use, and the data sets that they have access to. It goes well beyond the scope of what we have access to. And that means we are in a much better position to combine all these scores to, identify fraudulent payments.
So Q4 sounds promising, busy, hopefully productive in terms of actually putting some of this data to work in the wild.
Well, it's really exciting, and don't only see those fraud technologies go live, we also see a massive uptake on the processing side in Form 3. So we're onboarding a lot of customers and a lot of volume at the moment. And the interesting thing here is this works better if you have more data.
Sure,
and
of course.
The more data you have, the more effective it will be. And that's really exciting. And I said it before, I think you cannot really be a meaningful provider of payment technology on the one hand if you don't have a fraud technology on the other. So they go together. And I think we're in a really interesting space here. And with this Visa partnership, but also with the traction that we're seeing in the business today in the UK and in Europe and also the US, we're very excited about not only this quarter, but also next year.
Thank you, Michael. Great conversation. Great to catch up.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.